Hello again, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Fun and Games Podcast. I'm Geoff Moonen.
And I'm Matt A.K. Stormageddon.
And you're listening to episode 178. And this episode, we've been waiting. We've been waiting to hear back. It's been so long. They said they'd return. We have unfinished business. But I don't think they're ever going to make another game to finish that cliffhanger ending. And so today on this episode, we're going to talk about those orphaned franchises, those forgotten sequels, or just game series that fell off and we're left wanting more narrative-wise, but in general.
Geoff and I are sitting here just left wanting, wishing for our video game franchise husbands to come home from the war.
When will they return?
When will they come back? It's funny. Half of our topics come up from months of planning and us curating a list of topics to talk about. And then the other half come from a 2-minute conversation Geoff and I have about 20 minutes before recording. And I'm not going to tell you which topics are which.
I am. Today, we were looking over the announcement that there is going to be a remaster of Legacy of Kain Soul Reaver 1 and 2. Now, while I would absolutely love if there was a full-on Nosgoth collection that was both Blood Omen, that was both Soul Reaver, as well as Defiance, that also would throw into sharp relief the fact that they never finished the narrative. And for a series that is strongly built on its melodrama and character interactions and a wide sweeping story of alternate realities and time travel, defying fate, the point at where things were at the end of Defiance, the folks behind it and working on it have had highs and lows, personal and professional, and are seen as high and low personally and professionally. And there have been attempts, but I don't think we're ever going to get that finisher on it. But it's nice that they haven't forgotten it, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting with franchises that are quote-unquote dead is that sometimes they'll still do remasters and re-releases. And so in theory, you can consider that that means the franchise is still alive. But typically those are to test the waters. They rarely sell as well as a new entry, I think. Although it depends. So that remaster that you mentioned is being done by Aspyr, who's done a ton of them. They did the KOTOR ones. They did a bunch of the old Star Wars games. They recently did Bounty Hunter, which was the most recent remaster they've done. And most of them are just graphical and audio sprucing up. There's no mechanical changes.
Yeah, they're not Digital Eclipse. They're not M2. They're not doing that deep of a thing, but they are very competent in what they do. So I feel that this remaster will happen, and I feel good about how it will play.
Yeah. The downside, though, is that these remasters don't always lead to new stuff. Now, you could argue that the Aspyr remasters of KOTOR 1 and 2 led to the Saber Interactive remake. That is, in theory, as of yesterday, more news that it's still in production. I'll believe that when I see it. But it's interesting that there are some games that when they don't do well, they just kill them and that they don't keep going. And we have some that only have fallen off as recently as the PS4 and Xbox generation. And then there are others, I think of Defiance, which I never played. I played both Soul Reaver games. I played both Blood Omen games. Blood Omen 2 is one of my favorite PS2 games ever, which we got into in our PS2 episode.
Yeah.
But like Defiance was a PS2 game.
Yep.
It might have been on Xbox, but it was definitely a PS2 game.
I think it was, yeah.
And that's the last time we ever got a new game in this series until this now remaster, which is not new, but it is a recent release of that franchise. I mean, we just saw that recently. There's a Capcom collection that's coming out that is bringing Power Stone 1 and 2 back. We recently saw the Marvel vs. Capcom fighting collection was announced as of when we're recording, and Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite tanked. And now that was last gen. That wasn't that long ago, but like Marvel vs. Capcom 2 was nowhere to be found, but they announced Marvel vs. Capcom 3. It was a huge hit. And they're like, great, let's keep this rolling. Let's do Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite. And it was one of the most infamously hated fighting games I think ever made. I get why that kills a franchise, but like I have to imagine Defiance didn't sell great. What always is curious to me is when games seem to be a fan favorite and they disappear and we never see them again. Like the one I think of the most is Beautiful Joe, one of the Capcom 5.
Capcom 5. 4 were released. 5 were intended.
Right. But like Beautiful Joe got a sequel. The first game was fantastic. The sequel was pretty good too. I like the first game better.
And there were 2 separate interpretations of it on the DS and the PSP.
Yeah. And like, I think that they did pretty well. I mean, they probably didn't do as well as like Resident Evil or Killer 7, which also only kind of did okay. It's recouped, I think, since coming to PC. But like, Beautiful Joe is still trapped on the PS2 and the GameCube. We've never gotten new releases of that. And it seemed like it was going to be a new franchise for Capcom that was like a cool action side-scrolling combat game that we just hadn't seen.
Yeah.
For the longest time, Devil May Cry seemed like it was dead. We got the fourth one, and then there was this huge gap. Well, we got the fourth one, and then we got, I can't remember if DMC came first and then the fourth one, but they were in the same generation, the 360 generation. Rumors were that DMC and Ninja Theory's interpretation destroyed that franchise, and then we eventually got Devil May Cry 5, which was a huge hit and people loved on modern platforms as of last gen. And so you never really know where this stuff is going to go. But I think what's also really important is like a game like Devil May Cry, if we didn't get the fifth installment, 4 ends on basically a cliffhanger. I mean, all of those game stories are kind of nonsense. Bayonetta 3, which was not as good as the first two games, also kind of ends on this cliffhanger with a new character, but it sold poorly. It was poorly received. They did a prequel as their next game in a different genre. So, like, I could see Bayonetta becoming a dead franchise because of how poorly the third one was received, the drama with the original voice actor, all of that stuff. It's kind of sad when these things kind of just fall to the wayside. I think that there are a lot of reasons why it can happen. I don't think it's just financial, though that's definitely part of it. But I think there are a lot of things that can lead to a franchise kind of dying in the water.
Yeah, and given that sometimes some of these games do get picked up again and do get a sequel far in the future one way or another because of financial reasons, they needed to take a little while to put it together, they never fully abandoned it, whatever else. There are things like, say, for Beautiful Joe, it was a Capcom game, but it was also a Clover Studios game. Clover Studios being a subsidiary within Capcom, they also made Okami. But they no longer exist, really, and most of those folks, I think, are with Platinum now, or at least as far as most of the more well-known ones. But the fact is that Beautiful Joe, who does Beautiful Joe belong to? So even if we get another Beautiful Joe-like game, it probably won't be the old Henshin hero himself.
And you mentioned Okami, another dead franchise. We got 2 of those games. It was the sequel's DS or 3DS? I can't remember.
DS, I believe.
Or prequel. It was DS. And so we got a PlayStation game that eventually got ported to other systems. It was ported to current gen as of the PS4 era. I got it on Switch and played it for the first time to completion there. You would think with a remaster and re-release of that, again, we would get a new entry. But there's been nothing, no word. There's a version of the main character from Okami. There's a reference in Astrobot. And actually, this is a really timely discussion because the biggest downside to the new Astrobot, as much as it's having fun with the history of Sony, and we're seeing all of these characters, there are Suikoden Astrobot characters, there's Yakuza characters, there's Sly. But the cynical take on it is that, and I don't necessarily agree with this completely, but I can see where people are coming from. This just shows the wake of bodies that Sony has left behind. And I can see that frustration. You know, there's stuff I don't want to spoil, but like there are references to franchises within the Sony oeuvre that have just had nothing about them since the PS2. And yet here they are in this game, Team Asobi, being able to reference them. I'm sure it's tons of licensing and other things. You know, and some of them aren't even just PlayStation franchises anymore. I mean, there's a reference to Yakuza. Kiryu appears in it. But they're not locked to Sony anymore. They were for many years, but they're not now. But Kiryu as a character is very much tied to Sony's history because the original Yakuza was only on PS2. The sequel as well, I believe.
Yeah, it was a big deal when it jumped to other systems.
Right. I think this is fresh in people's mind because of what a brilliant job that Team Asobi did, but also pulling from that history makes you remember, oh yeah, why haven't we gotten, like, seeing Samus in every Smash Brothers and then not getting a new Metroid game until the Switch, a real new Metroid game, because there were games on the Wii as well, the Wii and the GameCube, but the Wii U kind of went without anything. I mean, this is the story of Metroid as a whole. We think it's dead until there's a new game every time, right? Like, that franchise has these cliffhanger plots that kind of just end, and you go, okay, maybe we'll see what happens. It's probably why, to this day, I'm so happy about Dread, because it continued direct lines to Fusion, my favorite game, that I thought we're just never going to hear again. And, like, we are getting Prime 4 now, so it's now currently not a dead franchise. We've seen gameplay and cutscenes from Prime 4. Then we're going to, after Prime 4 comes out, we're going to go, okay, well, now 2D Metroid's dead again, because it's been however many years. Like, it's just, I think it's a mentality, too, because of how long the publishing cycle is. That's what I was meandering my way to. Off air, we mentioned Mass Effect, Andromeda. dead franchise as far as we know. BioWare's rumored to be working on the next Mass Effect that's going to tie everything together. It's vaporware as far as I'm concerned. Let's get through Dragon Age, which I'm excited for. But like, the game was so poorly received, they canceled the DLC, which then became a book. And like, the story is incomplete. But when Mass Effect, the trilogy came out, all three of those games were on the 360. In that generation, it was very common to get multiple entries in a franchise on one console. Like, we're just talking about the Soul Reaver series. I believe Soul Reaver 2, Blood Omen 2, and Defiance were all on the PS2.
Yeah, we had most of it on that generation of consoles. The only one that was exclusively on the PS1 was the original Blood Omen.
Right.
That's a pretty quick release cycle on things. I mean, even the Like a Dragon games, I mean, some of it can be cynically seen as reusing assets, which is, I think, smart of them.
Yes, agreed.
So you get Like a Dragon, you get Infinite Wealth. We're going to get Yakuza Pirate in Hawaii in February. What the hell? I'm so excited. It's nonsense. That can happen. However, it's very interesting to look at some of the different series and see what is expected of them. Something that's so funny about Metroid is the fact that, yeah, there always is a little bit of a cliffhanger ending. There's always a little bit of and the adventure continues to it. But at no point do they ever be like, Samus will return.
Nope.
Not giving a date, not giving a, in Metroid 6 or in Metroid whatever kind of thing. It just is. It's never dead. It's simply dormant. It's like a volcano. It's not extinct. Right. It has erupted in living memory and may erupt again.
But the long console cycle thing, the reason I was bringing that up is like you look at Spider-Man 1, which was a hit on the PS4, Spider-Man 2, and Miles Morales. While Spider-Man Miles Morales was multi-platform.
It bridged.
Spider-Man 2 did not, right? The Last of Us games also, like Last of Us came out on PS3, Last of Us 2 Part 2 came out on PS4. Then they both got remastered, so technically to the PS4 and PS5. But still, it's like these huge cinematic games. I mean, Horizon came out on PS4, and then the sequel came out, bridging the gap. But then the DLC to the Horizon sequel was only on PS5. It's just we're getting these bizarre things with franchises because of how long the development cycle is. And I think that can lend to the perspective of a franchise dying or being incomplete because those cycles are so much longer now. Why would you bring back a franchise that died to risk it not being a success and then not being able to make the next one till the next console generation anyway?
Especially if you're putting the sort of resources and money into making it a marquee title, if it doesn't meet whatever wild aspirational expectations that is necessary to consider it a wash, if not a success, then yeah, you're going to look at games and within a week go, well, it's not performing as well as we want. We're going to pull the plug on it. This is a little bit of my cynicism showing through that I try not to let out too often, but there is a vicious cycle that goes on there. I often think about this sort of disappearing AA title.
Mm-hmm.
They still exist, but the notion of a larger company having several smaller franchises, looking at the Astrobot graveyard of fun, nostalgic franchises versus, say, what Nintendo does. Nintendo keeps a lot of things in-house. Whether that's good or bad is not for this current discussion. But it does mean that whenever they want to revisit something, it's easy.
Yeah.
They can just dust that off. They can throw in a cameo. Everybody works with everybody. But something like Sony, they have great relationships with a lot of third-party studios. And so, Platinum Games or some folks from formerly of Clover could make a Beautiful Joe, but what would they need to do to get Beautiful Joe back on the screen, back in people's hands? What would Sony have to do to get any number of these characters to, bring back Klonoa? Or, I actually haven't played through Astrobot yet, so I don't know all of the cameos that are going on there. But, I know Metal Gear Solid shows up in there. That's not even Sony, but it is strongly associated with PlayStation. But that's its own cliffhanger series, too.
Yeah. And this also happens in movies. I think we think about it less with films because films they take less time to make than video games, especially the AAA games. And also the narratives are shorter, or time-wise, right? Like you can tell a story faster. But I think about TV series. I actually would consider this very akin to TV series and like the Firefly effect of it all, right? Where a series gets killed before it can even reach anywhere near its natural conclusion. Then it gets a movie, which sort of wraps up the story, but was not the original intent for the franchise.
Right.
Like, things like that happen all the time. You know, I think of the Netflix Marvel stuff before Marvel started making their own TV shows. Like, they're bringing Daredevil back, but when Daredevil first got canceled, people were up in arms because it was perceived as a huge success and then didn't get an additional season. And part of that is like the Iron Fist series was lambasted. People didn't like the second season of Luke Cage as much. And it ran into the problems that a lot of TV, Marvel TV, has had even on its own. It's the too much effect, right? It becomes overwhelming. You want to tell these interconnected stories. You take this time to build up this world, but people get overwhelmed and inundated.
And that's where 80-hour video games actually pay off.
Right. But like, I'm just getting tired of games that seem beloved that don't get that second chance. Part of this, I think also, these dead franchises is because people aren't allowed to make mistakes. Hi-Fi Rush almost became a dead franchise after one game. Thankfully, it was rescued, and supposedly the studio that bought them with the intent of making a sequel, which will be great. I think about Titanfall a lot, a game that I only played the sequel because the first game was just mostly an online game. The sequel had a story and online play. It's a game that I heard a lot about as being one of the best shooters ever made and never played it. And then I believe last year I sat down and finally played it. I think it's only like a 4 or 6 hour campaign, but it was in fact one of the most fun games I had ever played in the shooter genre, especially because you can be in a goddamn mech. And I was like, this is great. I can't wait for the next one. That we'll never get. And like part of that is like the franchise is technically not dead because Apex Legends, which is an online battle royale kind of style shooter that I don't know a ton about and I've only played very little, exists in that universe and characters from that universe appear in that game. And so that's the future of that game franchise for now. But people clamor for Titanfall 3 constantly, and yet they could secretly have been working on it all these years. A reference you made to me when we were first discussing this topic is the Psychonauts 2 of it all, right?
Yeah.
We assumed Psychonauts 2 was dead for a very long time. And it turns out, you know, and we can quote Tim Schafer to some degree, though I'm paraphrasing, that he never closed the door on that. For him, games are natural as breathing in the fact that when it feels right, they'll make that push. And like, it felt right when they started working on it. And like, Psych Odyssey is a great reference for really understanding how something like that truly happens.
Yes.
Now, Psychonauts 3, who the hell knows? But like, because again, dev cycles take so long, financing is so weird, showing the profitability is so weird, I think there is a lot of hesitance to lean into sequels of franchises that have been dormant for a while. But again, Alan Wake 2 took 10 years to make. They failed and tried again. Control was born out of a failure to make an Alan Wake sequel. And like, Remedy is stronger than ever, it seems. The death of a franchise can be beneficial depending on how you try and bring it back. Nostalgia is a very powerful tool in modern gaming, but it still feels like there are so many developers that we have that have moved on from those things that never really got resolved and we'll never see them again.
Yeah. You bring up a great point with Remedy. Most studios cannot weather this idea, but it would be wonderful if more could, where in the development of a new franchise, a sequel to something, whatever you're trying to do, there are countless stories of games nearing completion and having to be scrapped for one reason or another, usually because something wasn't fitting or it wasn't that franchise anymore. And sometimes you can reconfigure that into a new thing or not. But being able to kind of pull the pieces from the refuse and make a new thing out of it, you know, you're reusing your assets, you're making use of things and just changing a few spots and making, you know, you're making your control. Hopefully that can sustain things because there is a much longer cycle on all of this. Matt, you're absolutely right. And yeah, Psych Odyssey, the Double Fine documentary, gives us almost too good of a look into that. So that when you think of other studios, you're either thinking, well, why aren't they doing that? Or are they doing that? And have I not known all this time? So there is something tricky about that. I mean, in the meantime, to keep Psychonauts kind of going and play with the development, they did make the VR game The Rhombus of Ruin, which I've never played and I knew about and learned a lot more after watching Psych Odyssey. And these are the ways it keeps going. And Double Fine is a smaller studio, relatively speaking, certainly smaller in terms of portfolio and what it tries to do as a wide portfolio. Capcom is littered with franchises that they just went, now we're done with that. When is Dino Crisis 3? Kind of thing.
We got it. It was called Exoprimal, and it was fine.
Fair enough. But even that's like a spiritual sequel to things. But Capcom is a larger company that has, across a lot of different genres, abandoned games. I know, as we're kind of talking about franchises where it's more of a narrative cliffhanger, they've abandoned a lot of really good fighting games. When is the next
Yes.
Power Stone? When is the next Darkstalkers? And some of that might be tied to specific creators. Some of that might be tied to whatever cited ideas of consumer interest are pulling on things. But if you go by fan demand alone, Mega Man Legends 3 would have come out a decade ago.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely
The
right.
fervent need for that.
Well, sure. I mean, and like Mega Man is a franchise that struggled a lot. I mean, when Mega Man X8 came out, it basically killed. Well, Mega Man X7 is really what killed the franchise. They still made X8. It didn't do well, and they shelved it. Same with the main Mega Man franchise. They did the retro throwbacks after a long gap.
Yeah, after a long break after Mega Man 8.
Right. Mega Man 8 didn't sell quite as well as they had hoped. They took a long break. They did the retro releases of 9 and 10. And then we eventually on Switch and PS4 and Xbone got Mega Man 11, which was incredible. I loved that new game. I loved the gear system. I loved the storytelling. But it's been all quiet since then. No other Mega Man anything other than these like collections. We've gotten the X collections, the regular collections, the Battle Network collection.
The Zero collection.
All great to have and all great games, but like there's no Legends collection. There's no new Mega Man game in development that we know of. There could be that they haven't told us. I mean, like their biggest franchises continue on and get new entries. They're leading with Monster Hunter and Resident Evil, which are both great, lucrative franchises that are doing really well. But like, I do feel like they often forget about the smaller stuff that they've left behind. It's funny, people think of Capcom as the Resident Evil studio very often now, whereas to me, they were always the Mega Man studio, because that was my favorite franchise that they made, or the Street Fighter studio. They have gone back to some of this stuff, but you're right about the fighting games too. Like, they've abandoned so many great fighting franchises that then now get remasters or re-releases and collections, which are great to have. But I sometimes wonder if the point of that stuff is actually to test the water or not. I imagine it is, but like, what are their metrics? What are the sales goals? I mean, I remember the creative director for Dragon's Dogma and Devil May Cry said that if more people bought Dragon's Dogma 1 on Switch when it was re-released, then they would think about releasing Devil May Cry 5 on Switch. Now, they haven't done that, and I think part of that is because the Switch can't handle it. I do know that these companies look at that stuff. And I mean, if you want to talk about a company that's littered with dead franchises, we should look no farther than Square Enix.
Oh, yeah.
Who also re-released tons of stuff, but to what purpose? I think of the Chrono series and how it has technically 3 entries. Chrono Cross was a massive disappointment comparatively to Chrono Trigger, which also sold well, but not like gangbusters, not in the way that the Final Fantasy series sold. People clamoring for some kind of HD remaster or re-release of Chrono Trigger, and what do we get? A remaster of Chrono Cross, which admittedly I haven't replayed yet, but just seems like a strange thing to choose.
I mean, I would put forth that Chrono Cross is an excellent turn-based RPG that has the misfortune of being attached to Chrono Trigger.
Yeah.
I can see the thematic parallels. I can see the continuation of the story, as it were. But I think it's just a great game on its own. Yeah, when you go, but I want more Chrono Trigger, you're not going to get more Chrono Trigger out of it, is the thing. So we are now at an impasse and a paradox.
And like the Dragon Quest series has continued on pretty steadily, and the Final Fantasy franchise as well. But like they have so many sub-series. Like I think about Parasite Eve 1 and 2. You recently replayed Parasite Eve a few years ago. That's an incredible game with such a unique idea. Survival horror, RPG mechanics. They did release, I think, like a third Parasite Eve something, right? On PSP or Vita.
They did Parasite Eve, which was an incredible solo but pseudo turn-based action RPG, which I freaking love, and did have the survival horror elements, the inventory management, and the character advancement of it all was wild. I really love that game. Parasite Eve 2 leaned a little harder into being kind of a Resident Evil game, for good or for ill. Third Birthday on the PSP was technically sort of a Parasite Eve game, but I'll leave that to more fervent fans to have their say on it. Going back to the idea of who owns what, Parasite Eve was a pseudo-sequel to a film that was based off of a book. This was rights on top of rights, so I don't know if we'll ever get Aya Brea again, but we might get something like Parasite Eve. But why risk that? Why risk making a new franchise built off of a cult franchise. Cult franchise definitely denotes fervent love for it, but not necessarily widespread. And the sort of numbers and metrics that different studios might be looking for, cult followings might not be enough, which does make me a little sad. I would also love seeing other studios take up the mantle as far as types of games go. I mean, you can't finish the story, but if you want a good Mega Man X style game, anything by Inti Creates is really going to scratch that itch.
Yep.
Like, hot damn. There are games now that are coming out that are, I believe, 45 Parabellum is one that sort of is taking up the torch of Parasite Eve. So, in some ways where games that are abandoned, they can be sort of thrifted and upcycled by other studios, especially if they're older franchises that we sit here and go, man, why isn't there like a real proper Dino Crisis sequel? There's nothing stopping someone else from being like, hey, here's some survival horror with dinosaurs. Is it going to be Regina? No.
Yeah.
And that's why, for me, a lot of this, looking at the different abandoned franchises, come back to the cliffhanger endings. We'll get more indie turn-based RPGs that are going to play like Golden Sun. Golden Sun's an incredible series, but I don't think Camelot's ever going to give us the continuation to Dark Dawn.
No.
Everybody talks about the first Golden Sun, and then they go, wait, there were more?
Yeah, I think the cause of the incomplete narrative or the franchise, like you mentioned Camelot, they became busy making Mario Party games and other things that weren't that franchise. They were good at making X instead of Y, and so the parent company made them pivot. I think of the Uncharted series, which mostly got an ending with the fourth entry on the PS4,
Oh, yeah.
but like that also feels like it's dead because Naughty Dog has moved on to The Last of Us. In the same way that Crash Bandicoot fell by the wayside, got scooped up and reproduced by other lesser studios, making lesser games because Naughty Dog was done with it. They had moved on from it after the original 3 games, I believe. And then these spin-offs and weird versions came out. And then very recently, a different studio, Vicarious Visions, who made the remakes for the modern consoles, got the opportunity to make a brand new game, Crash Bandicoot 4, It's About Time, picking up that original timeline, which is a very funny name on many levels.
Yep.
But like I think that pivot is also why, you think about Sly Cooper hasn't had a new game since PS3. And I've heard from fans that the PS3 game was not great compared to the older stuff. But like that studio, Sucker Punch, has moved on. The Infamous games also were huge hits. All of these studios have new franchises, and that makes sense, right? You want to work on something new. But I feel like when games were shorter and easier to develop for, it was easy to pivot between multiple franchises. That seems to be less common now. When it takes you 8 years to make the next Last of Us, and you only have so many people in your studio, you can't pivot off to make a Lost Legacy or an Uncharted 5 or whatever. And I think that's part of it, is that with going back to this long dev cycle, a lot of these franchises' narratives just kind of end, either with cliffhangers or without, is because the studio has moved on. That's fine, of course. But like I think about Spider-Man 2's cliffhanger ending, and like, yes, that teases that we might get a game with another character in the same way we did with Miles.
Mhm.
That will bridge the gap till Spider-Man 3, which is a great idea. We have no idea if Insomniac's doing that because we know their next game is a Wolverine game. For better or worse, a lot of the assets to that leaked at one point. And so we know that's an active development. They are working on finishing that game, which will be a miracle if it comes out for the PS5 at this point.
Right.
Even the narratives that are still going can very much, you could worry that they die because, I mean, Insomniac had layoffs not that long ago. Like, that's another part of this too. The landscape of dead narratives is wide from our youth and our past. But I also worry that it's in our future because so many of these studios are hemorrhaging talent in a way that's like, well, then what happens then?
And it's funny to think of either some franchises or some eras of gaming where people went, oh God, it's nothing but sequels. In some cases, we end up with, I wish there was more sequels. I want to see some continuations or iterations on these ideas. I would love to have seen a continuation to Xenogears, and not necessarily through Xenosaga or Xenoblade or any of those, but sometimes we work with what we can, and we can sit here in our recording chairs and go what if and as if and why can't they and whatnot. And sometimes it's how the games are run. It's sometimes how the dollar fell. Sometimes it's lost interest or whatever it might be. And it's funny to see the fan games and the fan ideas that come out of it while people try to continue that to show if nothing else, that the need for these stories, the need for these continuations persevere.
Yeah. I think that we've listed a ton of specific franchises, and there's a ton more. I mean, the franchises I've never even played, like the Killzone franchise, Onimusha, all of these games that have never got. Bionic Commando hasn't had a game since the 360 era.
I've been meaning to go back and play the Blinks games. A friend of mine loved those back in the Xbox era, and I never played them.
I mean, don't even get me started on mascot platformers. That graveyard is the largest, I think, of all of them. I haven't really mentioned Banjo-Kazooie yet, but after Nuts and Bolts, no one has touched that. Rare is basically become a Sea of Thieves machine, which that game is a lot of fun, so I totally get leaning in on that. But like, we're just now finally getting a new Perfect Dark after years and years of rumors, and Perfect Dark Absolute Zero being absolute garbage on the Xbox 360. I think with enough time, maybe eventually someone will get to it. Like, because obviously the new Perfect Dark is not being made by Rare. IP, I think, also becomes a weird thing with this too. Like, you think about these dead narratives, and like, it's like you were talking about earlier, whoever owns it, it's their choice. Look, we hate Konami here as much as the next person, and the franchise they hold on to. We're getting a new Silent Hill 2 remake from Bloober Team, but like, the only consistency I've seen in Konami, which is so bizarre, is this re-release of collections of the Castlevania games, which I'm grateful for. Though the fact that Symphony of the Night is still fucking locked on the PlayStation drives me goddamn crazy at this point. It's literally the only one now.
Yep.
The only one locked on the PlayStation.
I think that had to do with the agreement that was made in order to release it.
Probably. And like, maybe eventually it'll still be multi-platform, but it's one of those things where I look at this and go, yeah, well, Konami doesn't know what they want to do. Maybe they haven't heard a good idea. I mean, they killed PT, which is going to be this huge thing that Kojima walked away from, of course, and making very much sense on why and how he'd been dicked around. Kojima, not a perfect person, but definitely sounds like he got the raw end of the deal when it came to Konami handling the Metal Gear Solid franchise.
Agreed.
And like, I don't even know where the Metal Gear Solid franchise ended with. It was 6, right? 6 was the last one.
5.
5 was the last one. Was 5 not Kojima?
5 was sort of Kojima getting ousted. And I say all of this because there was Metal Gear Survive, but that doesn't count.
No. And like Metal Gear Revengeance, which is beloved, is just a whole other animal.
Was eventually beloved.
Right. Eventually beloved, right. Because Platinum Games was still kind of not new, but like they weren't the huge name that they are now when that game came out.
Right, and it's that kind of thing of people were a little mad that this is a Metal Gear game, this isn't a Metal Gear game, then more Metal Gear came out.
Yeah.
So it could all be part of the same bonkers-ass oeuvre, which I love.
But 5, is that a cliffhanger? Does that allude to more stuff, or does it just end?
It does link some things together. There is further exploration that could happen, and there was sort of an infamous piece of cut content, which did resolve some lingering threads. So whether or not that's canon or not, because it was never fully released, Mission 51 does remain a little bit of a overhanging thing. And in a series that some of the entries are in different time periods, so you can kind of get some different fill-ins, and there's plenty of, we don't need to obey reality. This is Metal Gear Solid, baby. We just need to go by our own internal logic. There can always be a little bit more. So where they have seemed to either cut it off or not, and rather infamously, Kojima wanted to finish the series with Metal Gear Solid 2, which had something of a cliffhanger ending as far as the story goes, but its own finality as far as theme. And then things continue, which is, I think, also why the Metroid series, I have a little more of a thing of like, yeah, there's always going to be lingering questions. That's life.
Yeah.
I don't imagine I'm going to die with every question answered. Such are things. Nowadays, with the finances and current state of the gaming industry, large studios can't have lots of small mobile studios in quite the same way that they were in previous generations or in previous times. Certainly not the way they're running it. There are plenty of smaller studios that are showcasing the fact that you can scale things back and still produce great content.
Yeah.
I would love to shout out Strange Scaffold as a studio that absolutely gets that. There's a fantastic sort of oral history of their recent game Clickholding that has kind of its origins and the notion of, okay, well, we're going to do this in less than a year. And there's a world where this is a $30,000 game, and there's a world where this is a $30 million game. This is the budget that we can work with, and so we're going to make that game. I'm not going to say it's so simple for larger studios to just do that, but it is possible. I don't know how much of that lesson can be learned, but I think that would allow for longer narratives to percolate and to be developed, and for some of these more interesting corners of a company's portfolio almost opening up and going, how long has that been there? Like, the fans remember these games because we replay them, but sometimes it may truly be a matter of, you know what? I didn't even know we had this. This is perfect. There's got to be, and I think there is one, and I just can't remember it, a case of a studio trying to make a game and going, we can't make that. We don't have the rights to it. Hold on. Do we have the rights to that? Yeah. Oh shit, we can make that kind of thing. So, who's to say?
Yeah.
I don't have a conclusion on this one as per usual, but as per usual, I'm looking to indies.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I never thought we would get a sequel to a Supergiant game, and we are. We're getting a Hades 2, and that's really exciting. Supergiant as a studio could make a different kind of game every game, and I would play it, right? Because I've loved a lot of their games, which are all very quite different. They have an aesthetic similarity and an ethos that I think is linked.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and then you look at Yacht Club, one of our favorites. Shovel Knight and Mina are very different games. However, the mentality behind them are very similar. And like, we got a ton of Shovel Knight sequels that are technically part of the first game.
And they were all promised, and they did all of them.
Right. Yars Rising, which came out recently, which continues an Atari franchise that wasn't necessarily looking for sequels or spin-offs. And it's a way forward game while still holding true to Atari's legacy, which I think is really interesting. There was no one clamoring for a Yars sequel, I think, especially narratively, and yet we got a pretty fun narrative Metroidvania out of it, which is exciting. And like, then you look at Shantae, right? They were one game per system for a while, skipped to console as well, but they're getting back to that one. But like, the Nintendo Switch has had 2 whole ass games, Half Genie Hero and Seven Sirens, both great. I think a lot of people longing for the previous versions of the game just based on some aesthetic stuff, some mechanical stuff, but all in all, still really solid games. And I think that ultimately the indie space is where these kind of sequels and franchises are going to continue to live. And if not those sequels, spiritual successors, which we've talked about in the past and we will continue to. You know, I think about how we got Pizza Tower and we're getting Anton Blast, and both of those took 2 branching paths and different timelines from the Wario Land games to make 2 very different games, still holding true to a legacy of previous games before them.
Yeah.
You think about Freedom Planet, which like started as a Sonic fan game before Sonic Mania was a thought, and then became its own video game that pays homage to Sonic, but Freedom Planet 1 and 2 are very different from Sonic. And I think you're right, at least on the mechanical side as well as the narrative side, that we may not get those exact stories, but we might get something a little similar. You mentioned Straight Scaffold, El Paso Elsewhere, is basically an unabashed love letter to Max Payne. But it's its own narrative, it's its own story, it has its own mechanics. But it is clear that it is devoted to Max Payne, a franchise that is now getting a remake of its, I think, first 2 games. For sure, the first one. I think we live in this world where the potential for dead franchises to come back start with a remaster or remake. And I don't know that I love that.
Same.
We've done long episodes on remasters and remakes. I think we will continue to. But like, again, we mentioned Chrono Cross before. I think it deserved a remaster. In all seriousness, that game, I gave it the short shrift because it was never going to live up to Chrono Trigger. I'm excited that I can eventually at some point, when I have 40 hours to throw at a wall, to actually replay that game.
Yeah.
But it would not have been any of the fans' first choice of what to remake. For sure, Radical Dreamers, which we sort of got a re-release of, or the original Chrono Trigger is what people are clamoring for, and yet they do this one. Was it cheaper? Was it easier? Were the rights easier to sort? Who knows, right?
Right.
And then we get a remake of Super Mario RPG, which feels great, feels different from the original, but it still feels very much its own thing and well done, in the vein of the Link's Awakening remake as well. Zelda's never going to be a dead franchise, knock on wood. It's going to be around forever. But like, Link's Awakening and that style of game was considered dead because the 3D Zeldas were doing so well. And Link's Awakening is like, all right, well, they did a remake of a game I've never played. I'll play it because I love the top-down Zeldas. We're never going to get another one of these. But now, because of the success of that remake, we are getting a wholly original Zelda game playing as Zelda in that style. And I don't think that would have happened without that remake, right? Like, it was the proof of concept. And so it's a really nebulous space that we live in, I think, where the kind of dead narratives and dead franchises, before we can continue those stories, they always want to test the water with a remake or re-release. I'm not convinced that it's not a good idea, but I'm also not convinced it is.
Right.
I would need to do more research on the numbers and stuff, which I'm sure is out there. But it feels like, well, instead of just re-releasing the old thing, just release the new thing and see if people like it on its own merits. Like, it's hard to say which is the better one. I don't necessarily believe the remaster path is the only path, at least.
Yeah. I definitely can sit here and speak from what feels, I don't know, ethically, morally, cosmically correct. Where, yeah, you utilize the environment that you're in now, the gaming environment that exists, and you make a new entry in the franchise. Oh, people like it. Great. Well, while we work on a new game, if we're working on a new game, here is a collection of the older games.
Yeah.
Which is a way to kind of keep things going. It is a question of chicken and egg in terms of continuing a franchise. Whatever the numbers say, whether they're correct or not, those are in fact two different things. Whatever that is, this is where we are now. And there's going to be a little more stealing of ideas in making of fan games. I mean, Matt, something we were talking about when we first were discussing having this topic for this episode, I was thinking of movies that have a very long time between getting made. As you pointed out, movies, they can be in development hell for a very long time. They can be in, the pre-production stages for a very long time. But once you're going, as it were. If a beloved film franchise then has a sequel 20-something years later, you can have a bunch of the old cast. You could have the old production team there. But it has been long enough, and they have not touched it in long enough, that, as far as I'm concerned, it is just the most authoritative fan film that can exist. As far as I'm concerned, something like Indiana Jones and the Crystal Skull is just a very authoritative or respectable fan film of the Indiana Jones trilogy. Whereas if something like Psychonauts 2 took as long as it did, I don't call that a fan game. I call that, just a video game that took a long time. But I think that sort of fan film, fan game approach, as studios are acquired or dissolve or move around, and so people who worked on the original are elsewhere, or people try to continue it to the best of their ability, take up the torch, whether mechanically, like Freedom Planet, or narratively elsewhere. There's an interesting convergence of fan content, both official and unofficial, that are going to give us the closure that we're looking for.
Sure. And I think also, just like any game could be somebody's favorite, I think also any game could be perceived as a fan game, in the sense that the people who are making it are likely fans of something else.
Yeah.
Your Nathan Drakes from your Tomb Raiders and Lara Crofts.
What is Tomb Raider but just a really elaborate Pitfall fan game?
I mean, obviously. Everybody's saying this.
There's a cipher that Pitfall Harry becomes Lara Croft. It's obvious. It's all right there. It's the palette of the game matches the palette of her outfit. It's so obvious.
Okay.
I don't know who's yelling right there, but it's...
Yeah, before Geoff goes full Pepe Sylvia, let's wrap this episode up. I know that our listeners have favorite dead franchises that they lament. I know that they want these series to come back. Let us know in the comments, either online or in our Discord, wherever you can reach us on social media. What are some of your franchises that have been dormant for a long time? Are there some that recently got like a little bit of a heartbeat with a remaster or getting a brand new game, and like how that made you feel? Talk about the kinds of things that you look for when you are trying to engage in a franchise. Is it long running? Is it short? How often do the games come out? Do you care about the narrative? Those kinds of things. I think we ultimately come to franchises for different things, but at the end of the day, we want closure, whatever that means. And there are so many game franchises that don't get that kind of closure.
We want our complete experience, as it were. Have you had to make your own little headcanons about things? Where do you stop the story? Is Sly Cooper just a nice trilogy that was on the PS2 so it could have a happy ending? Did you actually try to play in the closed beta of Legacy of Kain Nosgoth, the MMO game of Legacy of Kain? Where do we go on these things, and what are the stories that you like to see, and where are we hoping for them to go? Where are your glimmers of hope? We all just need some hope here, because sometimes A little news for you is a great deal of hope for all of us. So let us know. Reach out. There's so many great ways to get in touch with us. We are Fun and Games Pod across all social media that we are active on. As of this episode, those platforms are Twitter, Instagram, Blue Sky, and Tumblr. You can email us at funandgamespod@gmail.com. Let us know what you thought of this episode, what you thought of previous episodes, what you'd like us to talk about, and who you'd like us to talk with on future episodes. Show us your complete collection of a game series that has not been completed. Your complete incompletes, as it were. That's a fun thing to call it. It's not going to catch on, but I just like it for this moment right here. You can also visit certainpov.com and find not only a bunch of other fantastic Certain POV podcasts, but also a permanent invite link to our Discord server, where a lot of these topics often come up and are discussed, and sometimes we have some other fun ideas, and those are other just great places to keep this going. If you enjoy this show and would like to support us, or just otherwise get a one-stop shop of everything we're working on, you can visit our Patreon, patreon.com/funandgamespod. There is a free tier which allows you to participate in polls for when we do console retrospectives or anything else we may run polls about. And you'll get notifications about any articles we may write or things that we're working on in addition to these episodes. We are very thankful and grateful for those who are supporting us and helping us to better do what it is we're doing here. And we especially want to shout out those on the high score tier and above. And today, the high score board is Alex Lavelle, Case Aiken, Daniel Needon, Roger Reichardt, Alejandro Alves, Curly Bright, Film It Yourself, Patrick Edwards, Robert Prine, Sean Bowen, and Wes Bates. Thank you so much for your support. Please enter your initials. We promise we're going to be back for episode 179. I promise you, I am so certain of it. We are not suddenly just going to disappear. Or are we?
Another great way you can support us that doesn't involve any money, except our bribes, maybe, is you can go to your podcast platform of choice and rate and review us on those apps. Pocket Cast, Good Pods, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, all of them have some form of rating and review, and many more. It really helps folks find the show, so when they Google dead franchises, our podcast will come to the top with some punny title name that Geoff has eventually come up with after this recording.
Whether through rating on your podcast platform of choice, through Patreon, through joining us on Discord, or just simply listening to this episode. We couldn't do this without you. This is a conversation. Thank you for being a part of it. I'm Geoff Moonen.
And I'm at AK Stormageddon.
And happy gaming. Hey.
Oh, hey, Geoff.
What's going on, guys?
Oh, talking about Superman.
Oh, cool. I could talk about Superman.
I could talk some more about Superman.
We know.
I'll bet a few people would want to get in on this.
I'm down.
You know it.
That sounds like fun. I'll do it.
Cool, let's do it. We can call the show Men of Steel.
And you can find it at certainpov.com.
Or wherever you get your podcasts.
Yay.
CPOV. CertainPOV.com.